So there you have it. In 1998, CNN went on to report, in early May, sensors on at least 10 science satellites started picking up indications that electrons were accelerating. On May 19, a heavily used telecommunications satellite, Galaxy 4, failed suddenly, and 45 million customers lost pager service. Scientists think the electron flow contributed to this outage. Such fluxes may also have contributed to the failure of a Canadian telecommunications satellite, Anik E1, in 1996. The risk to NASA's manned space program is less certain. Satellites orbit 22,000 miles above the planet in the midst of the most energetic fields of the Van Allen belts. 22,000 miles corresponds to nearly 35,500 kilometers. This is well beyond the end of the outer Van Allen belt. So how can satellites orbit in the midst of the most energetic fields when their reported altitudes are clearly outside the belts? There is another contradiction to the data. In spite of everything we are told, the propaganda would have you believe that the Apollos travelled through the least energetic areas of the Van Allen belts.
The Van Allen belt is real, but it's pretty easy to get through it safely. The astronauts just skimmed the outer edge of the belt, where the radiation is lowest.
How can the propaganda allege that the outer belt is less intense than the inner belt, when in fact the 1998 CNN report and also James Van Allen's 1959 Scientific American article clearly state that the maximum intensity of the radiation is in the outer belt?
On October 11, 12, and 13, Pioneer 1, the first lunar probe, carried our instruments nearly 70,000 miles out from the Earth. Though its readings were spotty, they confirmed our belief that the radiation extended outward for many thousand miles, with its maximum intensity no more than 10,000 miles above the Earth. The inner belt reaches its peak at about 2,000 miles from Earth, the outer one at about 10,000 miles. Beyond 10,000 miles, the radiation intensity diminishes steadily. It disappears almost completely beyond 40,000 miles. The maximum intensity of radiation in each belt is about 25,000 counts per second, equivalent to some 40,000 particles per square centimeter per second.
In addition to this, many propagandists have tried to allege that many low Earth orbit spacecraft have safely and routinely encountered the Van Allen radiation belts.
They're also lying when they say only Apollo went through the belt. Gemini 2 did as well, and the International Space Station travels through the lowest part of it several times a day.
In his quote-unquote review of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, Jay Windley claims,
the typically cited lower altitude of the inner Van Allen belt is 400 miles, 650 kilometers, while portions such as the southern magnetic anomaly dip to a mere 250 miles, 400 kilometers above the surface.
But elsewhere, Windley suggests a lower altitude for the South Atlantic anomaly.
Ironically, similar problems face the crew of the International Space Station. Although the space station does not venture out of Earth orbit, it kisses the lower regions of the Van Allen belts. And since the Alpha crews will be on station for months at a time, they actually require more shielding than Apollo crews.
The International Space Station resides at an altitude of 215 miles. For the ISS to kiss the lower regions of the belts, as he stated, then the anomaly would have to be 35 miles lower than Windley's claimed altitude. According to the Goddard Space Flight Center's website, the actual altitude for the South Atlantic anomaly is 500 kilometers, and the radiation levels are 50 million electron volts. In the same review, Windley writes,
Gemini 10 ascended to 475 miles, 765 kilometers, well into the lower reaches of the Van Allen belts, and Gemini 11 even higher.
Gee, what a coincidence that the Gemini 10 spacewalk photos turned out to be faked. Perhaps that's why they faked Michael Collins' spacewalk, because the mission's altitude would have taken him and John Young into the Van Allen belts.
We found the Carrying Fire book that has those two pictures still in it. The one showing him practicing, and the other one showing him in space. Collins in space. We got the book. He's taking photos of it.
To recap, the training photo of astronaut Michael Collins aboard the KC-135-0G simulator was doctored to depict Collins floating against the black of space on his supposed Gemini 10 spacewalk. In response, Jay Windley and Jim Olberg spread false allegations that Ralph Rene walked away from a $10,000 offer to validate his claims.
He didn't offer me shit. We went to war immediately.
You would have... So you're telling me...
He never offered me dick for nothing. Right away we went to war. I wouldn't take no shit from him.
Curiously, although Gemini 11 was supposedly the highest altitude flight before the moon missions, its record altitude is apparently uncertain. The Goddard Space Flight Center's website claims it reached an altitude as high as 1,374.1 kilometers. Yet the Kennedy Space Center claims its altitude was 1,368.9 kilometers. Wikipedia and Answers.com give us two highest altitudes on the same page. Under mission parameters, we are told it flew to an altitude of 1,374.1 kilometers. Yet lower on the same page, we are told its record altitude was 1,368 kilometers. On Encyclopedia Astronautica, we are told it flew to an altitude of 1,372 kilometers. Elsewhere in his website, Windley claims it flew to 1,374 kilometers. And finally, at the California Space Center, we are told Gemini 11 reached an altitude of 1,400 kilometers. It seems that Gemini 11 certainly did reach an altitude that took it into the Van Allen belts. Yet somehow, they can't decide what that altitude was. Remembering that the Goddard Space Flight Center's website claims the Anomaly begins at 500 kilometers, how many manned spacecraft from all three space nations, China, United States, and Russia, reached a 500-kilometer altitude required to encounter the South Atlantic Anomaly? Unsurprisingly, almost none of them. Wally Schirra made the record altitude for Mercury aboard Sigma 7 with his 285-kilometer altitude. Yuri Gagarin had already topped Schirra when his Vostok reportedly flew him to about 315 kilometers, outdoing all Vostok cosmonauts that followed. But spacewalking comrade Alexei Leonov allegedly outdid that with his 475-kilometer orbit aboard Voskhod 2. Soyuz TM-11 came close with its 400-kilometer altitude. The highest the Chinese ever allegedly got was on Shenzhou 6, when the craft rose to 345 kilometers above the Earth. Skylab made it only 442 kilometers above the Earth, whereas Russia's Mir space station orbited as high as 398 kilometers. Not even the Independence dared venture into the South Atlantic Anomaly.
Roger, shutdown.
After about 1 minute, the rocket stopped firing. The ship was now ascending towards space. "62 miles above the Earth, Spaceship One became the first commercial manned craft in space.
Even the 2 Apollos that reportedly didn't go to the moon stayed well below this anomaly in the Van Allen belts. Apollo 7 never got any higher than 297 kilometers, and Apollo 9 was even lower at an altitude of 192.4 kilometers. Gemini 3 to 9 plus 12 all stayed below 500 kilometers. So this just leaves Gemini 10 and 11 and the shuttle flights.